Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into some pretty choppy waters, right? We're talking Bitcoin, but not about buying a pizza with it. We're going deep on whether Bitcoin's success could actually be making global poverty worse.
Yeah, it's a pretty heavy question.
We've got research papers, analyses, even a striking image that really frames this whole deep dive.
What's fascinating is how Bitcoin has kind of, strayed from its original purpose. Remember, it was supposed to be this revolutionary currency.
Yeah, the whole digital cash spend it anywhere dream.
Exactly. Peer-to-peer, easy to use. But now it's become more like, well, digital gold. People are hoarding it, speculating on it.
Right, and that's where this poverty question comes in. Speaking of which, we actually have this image. It's stark. A desolate landscape, almost post-apocalyptic, and there's this single massive Bitcoin just dominating the horizon.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? It gets at this question of whether Bitcoin is creating that whole new level of wealth disparity. And that's what two economists from the European Central Bank are arguing. Their paper really digs into this. They're saying Bitcoin doesn't actually generate wealth, it just moves it around.
Okay, so how does that work? They call it the Bitcoin positive scenario, but that seems a bit, well, ironic, right?
It does, doesn't it? But basically, they're saying that while those who got in on Bitcoin early are celebrating, those gains might be coming at everyone else's expense. Like, imagine a high-stakes game of musical chairs, and when the music stops, well, not everyone gets a seat.
So even if you're not into Bitcoin, its success could still negatively impact you. That's a bit unnerving.
That's the core of their argument. They talk about early adopters, the people who bought Bitcoin when it was like pocket change. As its value rises, their wealth multiplies. But the economists argued this wealth isn't being created out of anything new, it's just being transferred from people who bought in later, or not at all, to these early birds.
So it's a zero-sum game. Someone wins big, someone else loses. But it can't just be about who bought Bitcoin first, right? How does this play out in the real world?
Well, Bindseil and Schaaf, the economists, they paint the scenario where the price of, everything gets tied to Bitcoin's value. Imagine the price of bread, for example, going up and down based on how Bitcoin is doing.
So as Bitcoin goes up, your morning toast gets more expensive.
Exactly. And for the early Bitcoin investors who are now wealthy, they can handle these price increases. But for people without Bitcoin, their everyday expenses get harder and harder to manage. Their money just doesn't go as far, essentially making them poorer.
You're saying Bitcoin could create this two-tiered system.
Yeah, it's the concern, yeah. That as Bitcoin's value keeps rising, it could drive even greater wealth inequality, potentially destabilizing economies, even democracies.
Wow, that's a pretty dire warning. But we did find some different perspectives on this, right?
Yeah. We did. Amit Malekin, a well-known Bitcoin analyst, offers another way of looking at this. He argues that Bindseil and Schaaf, they're missing a key part of Bitcoin's value, which is its potential as a hedge against inflation.
Okay, so inflation, that's when a government prints too much money and suddenly your money is worth less, right?
Right. But it's a little different with Bitcoin. Its supply is fixed, unlike traditional currencies, which, can be printed endlessly. Look at Venezuela a few years ago. When they had that hyperinflation, people flocked to Bitcoin, almost like it was a life raft. Malekin sees that as a core part of what makes Bitcoin valuable.
So in a world where the value of traditional money is shaky, Bitcoin offers an alternative. It's a way to protect your wealth when everything else is uncertain.
Exactly. And this is where Malekin pushes back on this idea that Bitcoin only benefits the people who got in early. He says even if you buy Bitcoin later at a higher price, you're basically betting on it continuing to grow, on it being able to withstand the ups and downs of the regular market.
So it's less about buy low, sell high, and more about buying into a system, an idea that you believe will be worth more in the long run.
Exactly. But Bindseil and Schaaf, they'd still argue that this kind of speculation, even if it's driven by a belief in the system, well, it doesn't necessarily translate to something good for society as a whole. They compare it again to that game of musical chairs, and someone always ends up without a chair, right? They're suggesting that even if some people get really rich off Bitcoin, the overall effect on society could be negative. More inequality, more instability.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. But Malekin does challenge that winner-takes-all idea a bit, doesn't he? He talks about Bitcoin's potential to even the playing field, especially in places where the traditional financial systems just aren't working.
Absolutely. He highlights how Bitcoin could help bank the unbanked, give people access to financial tools and services they couldn't get before, especially in countries with weak currencies or where it's hard to access banks.
So for those people, Bitcoin isn't about getting rich. It's about survival, right? A way to participate in the global economy when they couldn't before.
Exactly. It's about empowering people, giving them control over their own money, and maybe protecting them from governments that are, well, corrupt or unstable.
That's a powerful argument. But this whole debate gets even more, I don't know, intense when you bring in the whole regulatory side of things, right?
Yeah.
The ECB paper, it's not just raising concerns, it's practically like a call to action.
Yeah, no kidding. Bindseil and Schaaf, they don't beat around the bush. They say that because Bitcoin could be so harmful to society, governments might have to step in. They even suggest that people who don't own Bitcoin, they have a real reason to want to see it regulated, maybe even phased out completely.
Wow, that's a strong statement. So if you're worried about Bitcoin making wealth inequality worse, they're
Yeah.
saying you should support laws against it. No wonder some people in the crypto world saw this as like a declaration of war.
For sure. It was like throwing a match on a powder keg. People like Tourniester, a big Bitcoin analyst, he called the paper a blatant attempt to stifle competition, to keep the traditional financial institutions in power.
So on one hand, you have people who see Bitcoin as this potential engine of poverty, a way for the rich to get richer. And on the other, you have people who see it as a way out, a chance to escape broken systems and empower the people who've been left behind.
And the thing is, both sides have valid points. It's undeniable that Bitcoin could make inequality worse, especially if its value keeps skyrocketing. But it could also make finance more democratic, give opportunities to people who've been shut out.
So how do we make sense of these two sides? How do we weigh the potential benefits against the risks without falling into that trap of saying it's either good or evil?
Right, that's the million-dollar question. There's no easy answer. It takes really understanding the technology, how it could impact different people, and being willing to have real conversations with those who have different views.
It's like we're at this crossroads, right?
Yeah.
One path leads to a future where Bitcoin just makes the gap between the rich and poor even bigger, creates this world of digital haves and have-nots. And the other path, well, it's this idea of financial inclusion where Bitcoin helps those who've been left behind and shakes up the old systems. So how do we make sure we're going down the right path?
That's the real challenge. It's about seeing past all the hype and the scary headlines and really thinking about what this technology could mean in every way. We have to be asking tough questions about regulation, about who can access it, about the ethics of having a financial system that's decentralized and pretty much operates outside the usual structures.
Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about some fancy technology, it's about people, right? It's about making sure that everyone benefits from these new ideas, not just a select few. So as we're navigating this whole new world, what can our listeners do? How can they stay informed and be a part of this changing landscape?
Well, I think the most important thing is to stay informed. Don't just believe everything you read in a headline or see on social media. Do your own research, consider different points of view, and don't be afraid to question what you think you know. And talk to people, even if they disagree with you. Those conversations, those are how we'll figure out a better, fairer way forward for the future of finance.
It's about building bridges, isn't it? Between the tech people and, well, everyone else who might find all this intimidating or just too much to handle. Because ultimately, the impact of Bitcoin won't just be determined by the early adopters, but by whether it can reach everyone.
Exactly. And that means we need to work together to make this technology less mysterious, more accessible, and easier for everyone to understand, no matter how tech-savvy they are or how much money they have. It's about having a more inclusive conversation about Bitcoin and what it means for the world.
Well, there you have it, listeners. We've taken a deep dive into the world of Bitcoin, a world that's complicated, often contradictory, and full of potential to both worsen and alleviate poverty. We've looked at the arguments, the worries, and the opportunities this technology presents. And as we've seen, there are no simple answers.
The future of Bitcoin, and whether it will ultimately help or hurt those struggling with poverty, is still uncertain. It's a story that's still being written, and we all have a part to play in shaping how it unfolds. So as you continue learning about this complex landscape, ask yourself, what kind of future do I want to see, and what can I do, even in a small way, to help